Hi all, welcome back. In 2014, the share of renewables in the final energy consumption in the EU was 12.5%. In electricity production, it was almost 27%. These numbers are a great improvement compared to a few years back, but they still are far away from our 100% sustainable energy target. Why do markets struggle to include renewable energy on a large scale? And what can be done to promote renewable energy and reduce CO2 emissions? We learned that markets are efficient in that they match demand with supply in the most cost-efficient way. This means that the cheapest available electricity will be sold first. From an economic perspective, this should result in socially optimal resource allocation and, therefore, in welfare maximization. This, however, only works if the price of electricity reflects all costs. But does it? We discussed previously how electricity producers offer their electricity at a price that is at least high enough to cover their variable costs. For a power plant, the variable costs consist mainly of the cost of the fuel. However, when a fossil fuel power plant is operating, it also creates pollution. It emits carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, as well as a range of other pollutants. Without regulation, the power plant's owner is not confronted with these costs, so he has no intrinsic reason for reducing these emissions. The economic term for such costs is external costs. An external effect of a transaction, for instance, selling electricity, is defined as an impact on a party that is not directly involved in the transaction. This impact can be positive or negative. Providing someone with a vaccination against an infectious disease may have a positive external effect, as it reduces the risk of an epidemic. Air pollution, on the other hand, is a negative externality. As the owners of fossil fuel power plants are not confronted with the impact of air pollution and climate change, they have too little incentive to reduce harmful emissions from their plants. Neither do consumers have an incentive to buy green energy if it's more expensive. So how can we fix this problem? How to deal with negative external effects when markets fail to reach a socially optimal outcome is a fundamental problem in economics. There are two categories of policy instruments for dealing with external effects. The first category aims at fixing the market price. The second category is called quantity instruments. They regulate the effect itself. Examples of price instruments are subsidies in case of a positive external effect and a tax in case of a negative external effect. A CO2 tax is an example in case. If a CO2 tax is implemented, electricity from polluting sources becomes more expensive. As the price goes up, consumption will decrease. The effect of a price increase on electricity consumption mainly takes place in the long run, as consumers will choose more energy-efficient equipment. A more important effect is that a CO2 tax will cause producers to choose less polluting generation technologies, and so the amount of pollution per megawatt hour of produced electricity will become lower. The second, quantity instrument, deal with a negative external effect by regulating it directly. In case of CO2, the goal is to reduce the volume of emissions to a very low level over the next decades. Forcing generators to reduce their emissions will probably raise the cost of electricity, and therefore the price will go up. In theory, the same emission reduction will cost producers the same amount of money as when it is achieved with a CO2 tax. Therefore, it will lead to the same price increase, regardless of whether a price or a quantity type of policy instrument is used. By the way, an example of a quantity instrument for achieving a positive goal is a requirement, for instance on consumers, to buy a certain percentage of renewable energy. So what type of instruments should be used? Conceptually, the easiest solution is to impose a CO2 tax that is equal to the social cost of CO2 emissions. This discourages the use of fossil fuels and stimulates renewable energy. Now you are thinking, yes, but what is the social cost of CO2? That is a good question. Estimates range between several tens of dollars to a few $100s per ton of CO2. This uncertainty is not the main obstacle, however. We could impose a relatively low tax and adjust it upwards as needed in order to achieve the CO2 emission level that we consider acceptable. An important obstacle for a CO2 tax is that if one country, or the EU as a whole, Implemented on its own, it will cause such an increase in the energy prices that we are afraid that a lot of large industries will move away to a place in the world without such a tax. This could lead to a race to the bottom between countries taxing as little as possible. In the EU, an additional obstacle is that an EU-wide tax requires unanimous consent of all the member states, and that is not feasible in this case. The effect that we do not include the full social cost of CO2 in our energy prices has significant consequences. First, as the market does not provide a sufficient incentive for renewable energy, we need to implement a policy instrument for stimulating renewable energy. Secondly, as this does not mean that dirty power plants are cleaned up or closed, we also need to restrict CO2 emissions in a different way. Subsidizing renewables will reduce the wholesale electricity price, while it already is too low. As a result, there's too little incentive for energy savings and energy efficiency improvements. So we also need policy instruments for energy efficiency. A further complication is that people do not always choose the most economic option, as other considerations, such as status, habit, and lack of information, also play a role. In our next clips, we will review 3 main policy areas for making the energy sector more sustainable. We will review policies for stimulating renewable energy. We will present the EU's emission trade system, which caps total CO2 emissions from the power sector, and several other large industrial sectors. And finally, we will look at energy efficiency policies. See you there.